You're about to listen to a new episode of Audio Signals. Get ready to take a journey into the known, the unknown, and everything in between. Recorded at no specific point in time nor space, ITSP Magazine's co-founders Marco Ciappelli and Sean Martin follow their passion and curiosity as they venture away from the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society to discover new stories worth being told. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Blue Lava is the first business platform for CISOs to manage their security program. Blue Lava guides security leaders to effectively measure, optimize, and communicate their security program with confidence and ease in one platform. Learn more at bluelava.net.
Marco, you know what I like?
What?
I don't know.
Food.
You do know that part, yes. And but that's not what I'm going for this time. I like when we get to have guests back on the show, and we get to hear the follow-on stories that come from those guests. And our guest today is Geoff White, and we're going to get into who he is in a minute. But we had him on before with another gentleman, Jake Williams. We talked about storytelling and the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy and the media and that dance that goes on to tell a story. And of course, if it's a factual story, you want to have the facts, but sometimes the media tends to stretch the facts to get people's attention and get the clicks, which we talked about last time. But a story is a story, and a good story often comes in the form of a book. And Geoff has written a book, The Lazarus Heist, and we're going to talk about that. And there's a lot that builds up to this book. So I don't know anything. So I'm going to hand it over to Geoff to kind of give us the lowdown. But Geoff, a few words first. Who is Geoff? What's Geoff up to? So folks know who's on the show today.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Geoff White. I'm an author and investigative journalist. And I cover technology, mainly cybercrime. And as you say, I've done that for BBC News, for Channel 4 News, Sunday Times in the UK, Audible. And I've just written a book in the past couple of months, published a book called The Lazarus Heist, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. It's about how North Korea became a computer hacking superpower. And that grew out of a BBC World Service podcast of the same name, which went out last year. Well, Series 1 went out of that podcast last year. Season 2 is coming out later this year, later 2022. With my co-host Gene Lee. So we're looking forward to that one. So that's roughly speaking who I am, what I do.
Well, very cool. I'm excited about the two sides of the story, the story that you tell and how you tell that story, which many times can make the difference between a story that more people hear versus a great story that just sits somewhere, not being the right audience. And also maybe, I'm interested in how you adapt the story, maybe when you share it on a podcast versus when you write it as a journalist versus, a book writer. Because I know there's quite a difference there. Wherever you want to start, I'm happy. I'm right here. I got my coffee, so I'm good.
That's fine. Yeah. Well, to give the genesis of this, the story, The Lazarus Heist, about the North Korean hackers started out with the first book that I published, which is a book called Crime.com, which is kind of everything you ever wanted to know about cybercrime, but were afraid to ask. It covers the whole gamut, really, from the very earliest days of computer hacking in the sort of 1970s, right up to what was then the present day. Crime.com was published in 2018, so we just had the attack on the US presidential election in 2016 and all the results and fallout from that. And one of the chapters of Crime.com was about North Korea and how North Korea ended up becoming this computer hacking superpower, which is kind of weird. I mean, North Korea, most people will know, is not exactly technologically advanced. Most of its 26 million inhabitants don't have access to the internet. So how does that country end up being such a significant computer hacking force? So that chapter then grew into this podcast, The Lazarus Heist, so called because North Korea's government hackers, for those who don't know, are called the Lazarus Group. So called because just like the Christian Saint Lazarus, you think you've killed them off and they just keep coming back from the dead at you. And the Lazarus Heist was based on the heist that the Lazarus Group of hackers perpetrated on the Bank of Bangladesh, the National Bank of Bangladesh, where they tried to steal $1 billion. What's amazing about that story, and the reason it works so well for podcast and then I guess for a book, is that it's almost like a bunch of computer hackers have watched a sort of Hollywood heist movie. They've watched Ocean's 11 or something like that and thought to themselves, hey, we could do that. We could do that with computers. It maps out almost scene for scene like a heist movie. You know, there are certain tropes in heist movies that make the movie. And those scenes almost in the film are replicated in the computer hackers' operations against Bangladesh Bank. So that led to the podcast series. And then obviously podcast series led to the book, which takes the story onwards from the podcast. Podcast series 1 stopped in 2017 with the WannaCry cyber attack, a ransomware attack from 2017, which was attributed to North Korea, one of the Lazarus Group's jobs, according to the US government. So what I did with the book was simply took from 2017 onwards and just explained all the other stuff that the North Korean hackers ended up doing, which gets even more bizarre and even more weird. So it's a fun set of stories to put together.
And so in the podcast, do you break down, or you talk about each event or activity, or how does that unfold?
Yeah, that's right. So with the podcast, I mean, the bulk of it was going to be about this hack on Bangladesh Bank, in which the hackers tried to steal $1 billion. And we had this idea when we were putting the podcast together that we were looking at Netflix, and we were thinking, okay, if this was a Netflix drama, what would be the opening scene? And of course, the opening scene would be, the heist on the bank, the robbers breaking in. And we worked at that for weeks, trying to make that work as the opening of the podcast, because we were going to then flash back. So you have the heist and then you flash back to how the heist was put together, which is kind of how they do it in heist dramas. Just didn't work. We just couldn't make it work. And then we started looking at something we were going to talk about, but later on in the series, which was the hack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, which of course took place in 2014, a couple of years before Bangladesh Bank gets hacked. And as soon as we started making the Sony story, it worked. As a starting point for the drama, Sony is a company a lot of people have heard of. The people involved in Sony and involved in the film that sparked the hacking were very, very good talkers. So the backstory with the Sony hack was that Sony made a film called The Interview, which was all about Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, and an assassination attempt, in fact, a successful assassination attempt in the drama on Kim Jong-un. This obviously did not go down well at all in North Korea. They hated this film. And so the accusation is that the North Korean hackers broke into Sony and demolished the company from the inside. And so as a way of starting the podcast off, that Sony story was just fun, wouldn't be the word I'd choose. Certainly wasn't fun for the people at Sony who got hacked, but it was a compelling, interesting, easy start. And that was the first couple of episodes. Then we moved on to talk about the Bangladesh Bank job. So by that stage, you've sort of established that there's this group of hackers from North Korea, that they break into places like Sony, and the stage is sort of then set to talk about Bangladesh Bank and the break-in there, and the incredible money laundering exercise they did once they'd hacked into the bank. And then the tail end, the last episode of the podcast, was going to be about WannaCry, the ransomware attack, and the crazy story about WannaCry.
And
a lot of stuff in there.
I know.
Yeah.
I was looking at the MITRE Group has a page dedicated. Well, I'm sure many groups, but a page dedicated to the Lazarus Group of all the techniques they use to do their deeds, and then the A list. I'm pretty sure it's a fairly complete list of all the things they've been involved with respect to WannaCry and all the other attacks they've conducted. And it's just amazing the amount of stuff that they've done.
Incredibly prolific group. And it's worth noting, just we should clear something up. I mean, I use the Lazarus Group as a sort of journalistic shorthand, a convenient journalistic shorthand. There are other people, notably FireEye, who are far more detailed about how they describe the different hacking groups within the North Korean government. So there are apparently groups within North Korean government that are just focused on getting cash through the door. So this was the people who broke into Bangladesh Bank, for example. There were apparently other groups who are focused on stealing intelligence from rival governments. There are some aspects who are focused on breaking into opponents' military infrastructure. So we should sort of clear up, when we talk about the Lazarus Group, I'm talking about them in the whole. There are all these different subsets and subgroups within the North Korean military hacking system. And so when you took the MITRE reports on them, they'll be covering the full gamut of that. And it does cover a really, really big range of things. But the really interesting thing about North Korea, and the reason it's fascinating to look at from a cybersecurity point of view, is, the UK, the US, we have government hackers. They break into places, with government permission, but they break into places. What's interesting about North Korea is, because this country has been subject to international sanctions, which were placed on North Korea because of its missile tests, its nuclear tests, North Korea's run out of cash. It's been running out of cash for a while. It's really, really broke. And so the accusation is its hackers are now trying to steal money as well as other state secrets. And that stealing of money gets them into cybercrime and just normal criminal networks. Because once you've done the hacking and you've stolen the money, you need people to help you launder it. And that's led North Korea's government hackers into some really interesting alliances with street level crime, with just organized crime elements. It's fascinating.
Well, it is really fascinating. And one of the first things that come in my mind is, how strict you are to the fact as a journalist, an investigative journalist, and how much of creative freedom, let's say, license to decorate the story. And maybe as you do so, give us the kind of like the core of the story that is based on, and where did you go from there? How did you branch out?
It's a very good question. I mean, one of the things about writing a book which is quite interesting is that because it's all written down in black and white, it's very easy for people to pick over it and pick holes in it and so on. So one of the things I did when I finished the manuscript for the book, which is about 100,000 words, about 95,000 words, I think, the Lazarus Heist book, is I printed the entire thing out. And apologies to the environmental cost of that, printed the entire manuscript out and went through with a pencil every single line. And I read the line and, read what I'd said and thought, okay, what's the source for that? Can I go back and find a source for that line, for that piece of information in that line of text? Obviously, a lot of this appears in footnotes. If you read the book, there are hundreds of footnotes. And so I have to have a source for every single thing I'm saying. Could be an interview with somebody, could be a document, could be something I found online, but I've got to, if somebody comes back at me and says, Geoff, how do you know that? I've got to have the thing at my disposal I can put in front of them and say, here you go. Now, in some instances, for example, it's the US government accusing North Korea of things. And North Korea, just to point this out, say they've had no involvement in any of these hacks and it's all been a smear campaign by the US government. But nonetheless, exactly. You would, wouldn't you? But the US government has put out a document and put out these accusations in a document. So for me, I've got a reference, I've got the document, I've got the page number. And in the text, I'll say, the US government accuses North Korea of X. And I'll give the reference with the page number and the reference of that particular accusation. So in that way, I am, when you talk about, am I beholden to the facts? Absolutely, yes. I can't put anything out that I can't source. There are moments where you do try to let your creative juices go a little bit. So one of the things we tried to talk about was to personalize and personify these hackers. We have, again, thanks to the US government, some information, some biographical information about some of these North Korean government hackers. And my co-host, Gene Lee, in the podcast, does a great job of just filling in the background about how North Korea works, how these young lads, they are usually young lads, get groomed through the military and go on these overseas hacking expeditions. And so you try and flesh them out as characters, and you do have to sometimes use a bit of creative license to do that, to flesh these people out a little bit. But I'm very cagey about doing that. I'll only do that if I think I can really, really justify what I'm saying.
And I don't write creative novels like this, even if they are based in reality. But I do write a lot of content, or have written a lot of content, and sometimes it's the story that comes from multiple stories, where and it's that creative part where you can say, kind of to your point of, well, who is this behind this? That sub story of who that person is, or what their profile is, helps the rest of the story. So how are there things in the book where you said, oh my gosh, this connection really brings something to bear that without it I wouldn't have quite that story to share?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I find quite interesting is a skill that I didn't think I had, or hadn't sort of fully clocked that I had, which is legal documents. If you read through court cases and legal documents, It's all in there. The story's all in there. It's just they're not written by people who have any storytelling ability whatsoever. They're written by lawyers who have to be very, very strict about the fact. So sometimes you have to read through the documents 2 or 3 times to A, work out what the hell they're saying, and B, suddenly realize, oh, here's the story here. So, for example, the North Koreans end up working with an Instagram influencer in Dubai who goes by the name Hush Puppy, who by day is posing on Instagram in his Versace pajamas and talking about how blessed he is to have all this money, but by night is doing computer hacking and money laundering, partly with the North Koreans, to make the money to buy himself the luxury goods. It's an incredible story. But one thing that bugged me as I was writing the book, and this is again one of the things, as you write the book, be very rigorous about connecting everything together, and writing a book really exposes the gaps in your knowledge. Because one thing I thought was, well, how did because Hush Puppy got arrested, and I was thinking, well, how did they find this character Hush Puppy, and how did they expose his whole connection with North Korea? And so I started digging into that and digging, and it turned out it was a completely random connection. Police in the US were looking into some little identity theft gang who were perpetrating these identity theft scams, and they just happened to luck out on a connection between that gang and Hush Puppy and his accomplices. And the story of how they sort of did that is really fascinating. There was a woman in the US who was tricked by an old school friend into giving over some information about some bank customers. And then the gang that she gave those bank customers details to went on these identity theft raids, and the US police force ended up finding this gang who were doing the identity theft stuff, and that led them to Hush Puppy. So suddenly this random woman in a bank somewhere who ends up being tricked by her old school friend leads you all the way to this Instagram influencer in Dubai who turns out to be the linchpin for the whole thing. It took me at least 2 or 3 attempts of reading the legal documents to piece all that together. And nobody else has. Nobody else got that story. Nobody else bothered. Oh, and the whole reason I ended up doing that was, as I say, I was looking at this Hush Puppy character, thinking, well, how did he come into the picture? How did they end up arresting him? In the indictment, in the criminal complaint against him that the US government put out, on the press release, there's a couple of people mentioned at the bottom. So Hush Puppy is arrested and sentenced, and at the bottom they just throw in these other people. A woman called Janal Aziz, and just throw in that name. So I phoned up the US government press office and said, who's Janal Aziz? What's she got to do with it? And they said, well, we don't know. I'm just the press officer. I don't know who she is. So I started looking for her name and looking for those names. And then I found the legal action, the criminal conviction against her, the criminal case against her. And suddenly it all started to unpick. So just a random name on the end of a press release suddenly throws this entire different light on the whole thing. I love that. I love that, finding those sort of corner turns and those bizarre things.
Yeah, super cool.
And I was reading through your bio, and you did another podcast series, if I'm well understand, about the dark web for BBC. And as you are talking about this investigation process, I'm thinking, what better place than the dark web to find these random stories, connections? I mean, you're literally exploring. It's almost like, Dante's Inferno, walking in there and find, how can you not have stories walking in there, given that yours are actually real and Dante made them up. So tell me about maybe the connection of, how everything is interconnected in what you do, and how it's hard must be to keep it separated when you're writing one story versus another.
It's true, and so the series The Dark Web was for Audible a few years ago. Basically, it was about how does the dark web come about? And again, there's another bizarre story about how the dark web is invented by the US government, of all people, the US Naval
Research. You can
Research.
tell us that if you want.
Yeah. So US government, as the internet sort of starts to come out starts to gain traction in the 90s, the US government realizes that the internet's a great tool for getting information and but basically doing intelligence work. But the internet has a big problem for spies, which is that as you move across the internet, your traffic is hopping from computer to computer on the internet, and each of those nodes through which your traffic hops can potentially surveil your traffic. So imagine you work for the CIA and you want to access a jihadi website. Well, all the hops that your traffic goes through can see. This is the CIA trying to access Jihadis Are Us, or whatever the website's called. And even worse, the Jihadis Are Us website can see that it's the CIA trying to get access to the website. And that's no good. If you're the CIA, you want to stay undercover. So they invented the dark web. And what the dark web does is it wraps your traffic in layers of encryption so that as your traffic moves around the internet, the intermediaries who are passing your traffic along to the eventual destination can't see who you are and where you came from. And perhaps more importantly, the destination website you're visiting can't see who you are, where you came from. Brilliant piece of technology. Problem is, as soon as you start using that dark web technology, you stand out like a sore thumb. Multiply encrypted traffic on the internet stands out. So then the US government's got a bit of a problem. They've got this fantastic tool, but as soon as they use it, everybody's going to go, oh, hang on, that's the US government using it. So they spread it around. They gave it to a group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who some of your listeners may know, a civil liberties campaign group, originally founded by a guy called John Perry Barlow, who was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, the sort of arch psychedelic rockers. So John Perry Barlow sets up the EFF. The US government is thinking, okay, we need to spread this technology around, because if more people are using it, we can hide in amongst the traffic, we can hide in amongst the crowd, and it won't be so obvious that it's just spies using it. So they gave it away to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, because of course, for civil liberties people, a sort of encrypted way of navigating the internet is great for subverting censorship. So for them as an anti-censorship group, it worked really well. For the US government, there's a sort of spy tool that worked really well. And, the two of them sort of met together and sort of shared the tool. And so that's how the dark web technology kind of comes into being. Obviously, the irony of this is the US government, having invented it, is also now having to spend loads of money fighting the crime wave that's been unleashed by the dark web. But just to bring this back to the sort of Lazarus Heist and the North Koreans, surprise, the North Koreans are hanging out on the dark web, learning how to hack, because one of the places you go to learn how to hack is the dark web. And so just to bring this back to Hush Puppy, one of the ways we think the North Koreans ended up working with Hush Puppy was because they were looking for accomplices on the dark web to help them launder their hacked and stolen money. And we think the North Koreans found Hush Puppy and his accomplices on the dark web offering money laundering services. So again, the sort of dark web technology and this idea of the dark web as being the zone where these criminals all get together comes back in the Lazarus Heist, because it's, the dark web is where a North Korean government hacker can get together with a money launderer in Canada or the Dubai or wherever they are and start working together. Absolutely fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I go back to the point where you said, how does North Korea, that isn't necessarily advanced technologically, how do they have such an army?
Right.
Yeah. And so it sounds like they're certainly using others and services provided by others and tools and techniques provided by others to do this. Do you also find that gives them some separation from the actual activities as well? Give them some protection that way? Or does it matter? They don't care.
Yeah, to a certain extent, yeah. Yes, it does. I mean, I think one of the things I've realized, and it's taken me a long while to realize this, is that computer hackers aren't necessarily good at all of the other stuff to do with financial crime. So if you're a computer hacker, you might know how to access somebody's system. You might know the vulnerabilities in the software. You might know the exploits to get into somebody's computer networks. But once you've stolen the money, do you necessarily know everything about how banking software works and how credit cards work and how cash points work and how you launder money? Possibly not. There's a bunch of hackers that don't know that stuff. So they rely on criminals, organized criminals, to launder all of that money. Spoiler alert, the next book that I'm working on is all about this. It's how technology and money laundering come together, how hackers and money launderers work together, because they're not necessarily the same groups. So for the North Koreans, just to use them as an example, they don't know how to launder money. They don't know necessarily how to wash it through bank accounts, but the dark web gives them that ability to do that. And in terms of your point about, does this give them some level of protection? It does, because just to go back to our story of our chap Hush Puppy, he's now been convicted. We're waiting to hear his sentence. His accomplice has also been arrested, sentenced to 11 years in prison. There's multiple stories of multiple people around the world who've been convicted for working with North Korean hackers. The North Korean hackers themselves have never been convicted and deny all the charges. And of course, they're in North Korea, likely in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. So they're never going to face justice, or at least very, very unlikely to face justice. So what they're able to do is carry out their sort of cyber operations from safe territory inside North Korea, but reach out through the internet to find these global accomplices. And when the shit hits the fan, it's the global accomplices who end up getting nicked and put in prison. The North Koreans, certainly as it stands at the moment, have got away scot-free.
I cannot think about, a mafia organization, because, it's organized crime. I mean, honestly, who's the one that get cut is the pawn, right? The
street level
big
guys,
usually they are well protected, and eventually you get to that. For our audience on this channel, maybe, it obviously it does mix a little bit, so many people would know about cybercrime and dark web and all of that. But I would say some other, and I'm assuming I'm trying to make a reference to your podcast, is Sean and I sometimes like, where do we draw the line between digging really deep into how cybercrime, cybersecurity work? How much you go technical in this, and how much you make it accessible? Because I remember in our last podcast we're talking about this dance about the cybercrime, the marketing, the news, and how you change things. How do you balance that in your podcast? And do you think that by doing this and making it a little bit more entertaining, still sticking to reality, did you create more interest in the everyday person that maybe didn't care about either cybercrime or hacking on the dark web, and all of a sudden like, hey, I'd love to learn more about this stuff?
Yeah, I think, to address your second point first, what I'm really, really proud of is the fact that the Lazarus Heist podcast was a #1 hit in the UK, and it got to #7 in the US podcast charts. And let's face it, Joe Rogan's podcast is #1. We made a podcast that's an investigative journalism documentary about North Korea and cybercrime, and it got into the top 10. That for me says that people, they want to know about this stuff.
Yes.
However, they want to know about it as long as you can tell it to them in the right way. And to go to your first point about how technical do you go, you've got to make a decision. The absolute arbiter for me is the audience comes first. And to go back to my point about calling this group the Lazarus Group, as opposed to using all of the other different names of all the subgroups, I've got the audience in mind. I don't think it's helpful for the audience to go through with them all of the different subgroups underneath Lazarus and what they all do. I will call it Lazarus Group, and that's good enough for the audience. And I know techies will come back at me and say, hey, you're just grouping them all together. It's more complicated than that. Well, you're not my audience, in fairness. It's the general public. I've got to make it accessible to them. When you come across something that's a bit technical and quite difficult, which we are doing quite a lot in season 2, by the way, of the podcast, you've got to make a decision. If you decide this is important and the public needs to know about it and it's complicated, you just have to get both feet in and just explain it to them really clearly, really carefully, really slowly, and they will get it in the end. I'm tired of techies telling people, oh, it's too complicated, you can't understand. That's a failure of communication there. There are certain things where it's like, no, that's just too complicated. We're not going to be able to do that. But at a certain stage, you have to say, look, the audience need to know this. They need to understand this very quite complicated piece of technology or piece of architecture to get what happens, to understand the story. We're going to take time, we're going to hold their hand, we're going to go through it with them, and we're really going to make sure they understand it. And I think listeners really benefit from that. And by the way, podcasting is a superb format for doing that, because it's a very personal connection. It's a sort of one-to-one connection you're trying to create. So you can say in the script, which traditionally you've not been able to say in documentaries on the radio, you can say, this is complicated, don't worry, I'll talk you through it. And as you're going along, you can say, right, just to recap, what we're talking about here is this. You can use analogies, and you can communicate in a podcast in a way that's a lot more human and a lot more friendly, I think, than you can in traditional radio, which I did quite a lot of. So,
yeah.
So with that in mind, this is Audio Signals, where we talk about all kinds of stuff from gaming to music to AI created arts, you name it. This channel catches it all. We can go off on weird tangents. So our audience is pretty general. They not rooted in cybersecurity. So what's the impact to them from this story?
The impact. Look, there's a macro impact. There's a geopolitical impact to this. We talked about North Korea being accused of stealing money. The amounts we're talking about are in the billions. That's a very, very conservative estimate. The amount North Korea is estimated to have made from stealing cryptocurrency is 2 billion, and that is a vast, vast underestimate. According to the United Nations, that money gets spent on buying and equipping nuclear weapons and missiles for testing by North Korea. North Korea is a nuclear-armed power, and given how unpredictable North Korea is, that's got to worry everybody. If you're in South Korea and Japan, it's particularly worrying, but North Korea is a constant thorn in the side of international peace. If North Korea did not have nukes, if North Korea did not have the regime it has at the moment, the world would just be a safer place for lots and lots of people. It's not unfeasible Kim Jong-un may decide to do something reckless. So on a macro level, it should worry all of us. And people think, oh, it's a faraway country, it doesn't really matter. Well, yeah, Ukraine felt like a faraway country, didn't it? Until quite recently. Suddenly that's having a lot of effects on a lot of things. So paying attention to the macro picture is important. On a micro level, I think the North Korean example is really interesting because it points out that we're still so vulnerable to the basic hacking techniques. North Korea's computer hackers, they're very gifted, they're very skilled, but their way in, time and time again, has been the phishing email, the phishing message. Bangladesh Bank, I've talked about. Sony Pictures Entertainment, I've talked about. Cosmos Bank, hacking that we cover in season 2, I'll talk about. The cryptocurrency companies that are getting hacked. The way in is so often the phishing message. And so if you listen to take away any cybersecurity message from this, it's just that your inbox, whether it be on LinkedIn, whether it be your email inbox, whether it be Facebook, Instagram, it's not your friend. It's a front door to a very busy street, and anyone can stick anything through the letterbox. So that's really the sort of the takeaway. And also, when you realize what can happen if you do click on that link and you do get infected, the amount of damage that can be done by groups like the Lazarus Group, hopefully it makes people sit up and think a little bit.
There are a lot of metaphor that you can use for this, but one of my favorite is you put a lot of locks on your door, but then somebody just convinced you to unlock it for you.
Yes.
And so we go back to the human level of social engineering and all of that. What is the vision that you had as you do this research? You talk about this thing about where are we going next, and this may apply to the Korean group or any hacking group, any Iran, they have their own and all of that. What can be done? Because as you say, it's such a small little something there, state, but they have money. They are using it in probably not a good way, not for their population or in general. And everybody else just can't really stop this. Or can they? Can we? Where we go from here?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's tempting at the end of this to have a fairly bleak assessment of the future and how things go. As I've said, the North Korean hackers are still at large, still at liberty, despite the accusations against them. And just this year, we've seen an attack attributed to North Korea, which was a hack on a game, a video game called the Axie Infinity game, or at least the technology behind it, the architecture behind it. They stole $625 million. That is the largest single hack on a single victim at a single time ever in history. There's other hacker groups have made more money over a period, but in terms of one hit, one victim, one amount stolen, it's the biggest heist ever perpetrated. I'm still waiting to be corrected on that, by the way. If anybody knows of one that's bigger, do let me know on Twitter. But you're talking about the largest hack ever, and that was North Korea this year. That's the attribution. So it's tempting to kind of think, well, nothing can be done to stop them. But look, governments, including the US government, are making strides against this. The Biden administration has, I think, partly through some of the attacks on the US government and US infrastructure, is trying to get on the front foot with this. You do also have criminal accusations against these people, which don't sound like much, good when you don't get those people into court and convict them. But the accusations and the criminal complaints that have been put out against North Korea contain all of the tips and tricks and tools that North Korea were using. Well, those tools are now burned. North Korea can't use those tools again. They can't use those email addresses again. They can't use those Facebook accounts again because they've been found out. So it is possible to chip away at the ability of these groups. You can't necessarily arrest them and take them down completely, but you can chip away at them. And the other thing is, I'd love to tell you there's some great government intervention that can sort all this out, or that your company's IT department can save you from all of this. You can't. There's that great quote from Spider-Man, with great power goes great responsibility. We have amazing power thanks to IT in our world. You can dial up your relatives on Zoom, you can chat to them, access your banking at 2:00 in the morning and make transfers. None of this was possible when I was a kid. That's great power, but with that great power comes great responsibility. Those same IT systems, the email inboxes, the social media, give hackers a way to hack into us. So the responsibility we now have, as the flip side to our wonderful new powers, is to start being a little bit of our own policemen and start being a little bit of our own IT security bosses. We unfortunately have to police our own inboxes. We can't rely on other people to do it.
Yeah, well said, Geoff. Well said. And I could sit here and listen to you tell bits of stories all day long. It's been a real joy.
You can. You just listen to his podcast.
Exactly.
That's where I'm
there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, so we have the pod. We're gonna include a bunch of links in this episode. Show notes.
Thank you.
Your podcast, your books, crime.com, and Lazarus Heist, and obviously your profiles. So hopefully somebody will come back and challenge you on that top figure.
Still waiting. I would, in a way, I'd like to be challenged on it, but the longer I say it, the less people challenge me on it, the more I'm believing it might be true. It's certainly one of the biggest. I can certainly say that.
There you go. Well, listen, it was great having you on the show, and always a pleasure to chat with you, Geoff. And congratulations on all the good work you're doing, and the new book, and the next one coming.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome back to talk about that one once you're ready.
Will do. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good. So thanks everybody for listening to this audio signals here on ITSP Magazine. Stay tuned for more conversations about anything and everything under the sun, including hacking groups in North Korea. Thanks for joining us.
Blue Lava is the first business platform for CISOs to manage their security program. Blue Lava guides security leaders to effectively measure, optimize, and communicate their security program with confidence and ease in one platform. Learn more at bluelava.net.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Audio Signals. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society, and some even beyond that.